Here we go. What a day. Breaking just moments ago. U.S. economy shrinking for the second straight quarter.
The country is in a recession.
The U.S. economy shrank for the second consecutive quarter.
In Washington, a troubling report on the U.S. economy is raising new concerns about a recession.
We're in a recession, and it's not the time to increase taxes or spending.
After 2 years of disruption due to the COVID outbreak, anybody anticipating the US economy would finally go back to normal in 2022 has been extremely disappointed. Supply chain issues, a war in Ukraine, soaring inflation, and higher interest rates are stoking fears that the US economy is on the verge of a recession. There is currently 50% possibility that the United States will have a recession within the next 18 months, according to the TDS Securities. Several trustworthy economic indicators are flashing red flags suggesting the US economy may be about to crash. Now, what is actually a recession? Although there isn't a specific definition for an economic recession, analysts and investors frequently use the phrase 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP. And by that metric, we are already in one. After falling by 1.6% in the first quarter of 2022, the US GDP shrank at a seasonally adjusted annual pace of 0.9% in the second quarter. Now, American businesses continue to hire and Americans continue to spend. In June, the US economy created 372,000 new jobs, significantly more than the experts were predicting. A US recession rarely coincides with that kind of job growth. Additionally, experts continue to anticipate that S&P 500 businesses will report second quarter earnings growth of 4.3% and revenue growth of 10.1%.
In the second quarter by 0.9%, on top of shrinking in the first quarter by 1.6%. Now, so far, all of the commentary that I'm hearing is talking about a shrinking of the economy, but the good news for the economy is that job growth has stayed strong. And that was why some people were questioning, well, maybe it's different this time. It's hard to believe that job growth can be up to 300,000 in 1 month when, in fact, you are in a recession. What's different this time is that we did have an inventory buildup. In other words, a lot of companies were holding on to inventory because of those supply chain shocks. When they were able to get the supplies that they needed, they were built up and weren't able to sell them. So at the end of the quarter, companies were complaining that they had too much inventory and they needed to mark stuff down. And that led to some expectations, well, maybe inflation is peaking. I see no evidence that inflation is peaking right now. We are at 40-year highs. However, we did see oil prices come off of the highs of the year in the month of July. So maybe in July we get a better, more manageable consumer price index than the current 9.1% that we have right now. There is reason to believe inflation comes down in July, but it can go right back up again. The bottom line here is the economy is troubled. Don't forget, 3 million fewer people are working today than before the pandemic. We are producing less oil than before the pandemic, and we are no longer in growth mode. We are in a shrinking mode. The economy got smaller, not just in the first quarter, but the second quarter as well. Dana, you just mentioned the White House tried to manage this, get in front of the number, tell us a recession is not a recession. We all know what a recession is. This is what economists have counted on for as long as I've been covering this, and that's 30 years. 2 quarters of contraction is a recession. No matter how you feel about it or no matter what you want to call it, people are feeling pressure. They're paying 35% more for a dozen eggs than they were last year. They're paying 18% more for meat and fish than they were last year. And so those costs are creating what we call demand destruction. Housing is probably going to be the area that you want to focus on most because you had mortgage rates now at 5.5%, and that has put a sharp dent in what we were looking at to be a very strong housing market. Bottom line, this is what the Fed wants. That's why the Fed is...
We are technically in a recession, I think, although maybe you could clarify that.
I think based on the growth is in...
It went down for two.
Let's let him do it.
We'll let you answer that question. You know, how is it, though, if we are in a recession, which you'll answer, that the Labor Department keeps reporting these added jobs? These seems to be all these conflicting indicators.
Sure, and I think that's typical when you hit certain times in the economy. You look at a great job report, but output issues coming from the GDP report. That's when you know you might be hitting these cyclical points, a peak or a trough. And as you look at that, you can say, sure, according to some definitions of recession, where it's 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth, we might be in it. But at the same time, you look at something like the job report and say, but we're having incredible job numbers going on and have completely recovered from that pandemic drop.
It is unknown when the National Bureau of Economic Research would decide to validate the widespread belief that the economy is experiencing a recession. Now, everyday Americans, of course, care a little for such technicalities, definitions, whether it is a recession or it isn't, when prices are rising so quickly and financial markets are struggling and people are living from paycheck to paycheck. Why are we worried about a recession? After years of lockdowns and restrictions, many observers hoped increased demand would generate a post-pandemic economic boom in 2022. Instead, we are worrying about inflation and recession. What actually happened? Well, there is 2 significant factors to consider, and that's inflation and supply chain disruptions. Supply chain disruptions in Asia and economic sanctions against Russian oil and gas have increased the US inflation problem that began in 2021. The Federal Reserve also underestimated how aggressively it would need to act to bring inflation under control. The Bureau of Economic Analysis recently reported the PCE price index rose 6.3% year over year in May. Core PCE, the Fed's preferred measure of US inflation, was up 4.7% from a year ago. Now consumers are feeling the brunt of increased costs for everyday goods, supplies and services, and the Bureau of Labor Statistics reported on July 13 that the Consumer Price Index, a measure of the cost of living, soared by 9.1% from last year. The fast rise in CPI is another inflation warning not seen in 4 decades. And how the Fed acted on this? In response to alarming inflation, the Fed has raised the federal funds rate substantially this year, including back-to-back 75 BPS hikes after meetings in June and July. This second consecutive 75 basis point rate hike makes this move the most aggressive since FOMC began announcing Fed funds actions back in 1990. And at the time of filming this video, the bond market is currently pricing 74% chance of a 50 BPS rate hike and a 26% chance of a 75 BPS rate hike in September. The higher interest rates rise, the more expensive it becomes for US companies to borrow money from banks to invest in innovation and growth. Rising credit card, mortgage, auto loan, and other interest rates also reduce the disposable income Americans have to spend in the economy, which is on the backside is weighing in on corporate earnings and stock prices. We also have to talk about yield curve inversion. Concerns about a US recession ramped up in early July when the yield on 2-year US Treasury notes jumped above the yields on 10-year Treasury notes, a phenomenon known as a yield curve inversion. Inverted yield curves have historically been a strong economic recession indicator. 2/3 of the time, The US economy has historically fallen into a recession within 18 months of a yield curve inversion.
This is what the Fed wants. That's why the Fed is slamming on the brakes on this economy with 75 basis point hikes 2 times in a row. We will likely see rates continue to go higher and an economy continuing to slow. So we are still talking about rates going higher. And as you watch rates go higher, your borrowing costs go higher, and the rest of the world get impacted by that, there's now talk of government debt defaults across the world. Europe is probably going to go into recession sooner than the United States is, because Europe has a whole gas problem as well because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So once we see Europe go into a recession, that reverberates as well.
Sure
Remember,
does.
this is not a decoupling. We are all in this situation together, and the global economy is under pressure. So
Now there is also a case against recession. Despite market fears and warning signs, many experts say the economy is simply way too good at the moment to consider current conditions as a recession. One of these experts is Peter Essel, who says the latest US jobs report should reassure investors. Year-over-year job growth stands at 4.31%, the largest gain in almost 40 years. It's difficult how some are claiming the economy is in recession when job growth remains well above long-term averages and wage growth is the strongest in decades. With the unemployment rate sitting at 3.6%, the job market may appear to be, at least right now, the only stable part of the economy. But that's likely to be temporary, as companies battling with the financial headwinds, including inflation, rising interest rates, and weakening consumer demand, have already begun to announce layoffs. In the Great Recession, unemployment peaked at 10%, and it took an average of 8 to 9 months for those out of work to secure a new job. So now could be the time to review your emergency fund if you think there's a shortfall. If you won't be able to cover a minimum of 6 to 9 months worth of expenses, which is hard for most people, see if you can accelerate savings by cutting back on spending or generating extra money. It's also a good time to make sure your resume is up to date and to establish contact with influential individuals in your professional and or personal network. If you are unfortunately laid off, make sure to apply for unemployment benefits right away and secure your health insurance. On the other hand, if you're self-employed and worried about a possible downturn in your industry or a loss of clients, explore new revenue streams. Aim to bulk up your cash reserves as well. Again, if previous recessions taught us anything, it's that having cash unlocks choices and leads to more control in challenging times.
And how would you advise everyday Americans to best prepare themselves for this continuingly unpredictable economic environment?
Well, I think one of the things that you do in these situations is that you take a look over multiple different time horizons. Don't just make your decision based on what you hear in the news today. Base it on what you expect to see over the next 3 months, what you expect to see over the next year. Major life events are a part of that calculation as well. When do you think you're planning to retire? What kind of strategies should you follow there? And then you talk to the people that you have as your advisors, your financial planners, your retirement planners, and those types of individuals.
While virtually everyone else has been struggling through the COVID recession, billionaires have done extremely well at the time. According to a report from the Institute for Policy Research and Americans for Tax Fairness, US billionaires' wealth grew by more than 400 billion. The wealthy are always more likely to win in recessions. During recessions, wealth and income inequality grows. Poor and indebted households are affected much more by business cycles. The winners in all recessions are the people who keep their jobs and hours, can work at home, and those with excess amount of cash and wealth to snap up what owners actually need in cash are selling lower-priced small businesses, lower-priced stocks and bonds, and perhaps even a lower-priced house or two. Should you be worried about a recession? If the US is in a recession or eventually ends up sometime this year or in 2023, there's no reason to panic. First off, recessions don't historically last very long, and US recessions are also fairly frequent. Since World War II, there has been about one US recession roughly every 5 years. While recessions can lead to job losses and other financial difficulties for people, they have historically been excellent buying opportunities for long-term investors. It can be extremely difficult for investors to time a market bottom perfectly, and stocks tend to bottom several months before a recession when peak pessimism is reached. Now, if you want to know how to save as much money as possible during a recession, then check out video over here.